The cold, neon-lit streets of the alien city were empty at this late hour, with only the hum of distant ships filling the air. The towering buildings, glittering in the dark, cast long shadows, making the streets seem even more desolate. Zira stood at the edge of the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the rejection that had just crushed her heart. Her silver skin shimmered faintly under the harsh lights, but it offered no warmth against the icy wind that swept through the empty streets. She had nowhere to go, and the world around her seemed indifferent to her pain. Zira's violet eyes, usually full of determination, were now clouded with despair. Her people, her own kind, had cast her aside like some broken thing, unable to meet their expectations. She wasn't enough. She had failed in the eyes of the very society she had always tried to belong to. The coldness she felt wasn't just from the weather. It was a chilling realization that she was alone in a world that had no place for her. A loud engine roared in the distance. Zira's ears twitched. A sleek alien vehicle zoomed past her, its occupants sneering as they glanced at her. Her presence made them uncomfortable. She wasn't like them. Her skin was a different color, her features more delicate, and she lacked the strength that many of the other species considered superior. Zira had always been different, but she had always hoped that someday her people would accept her. Now that dream lay shattered. The rejection was more than just a social blow. It was a fate worse than death. With nowhere to turn, Zira wandered the streets aimlessly, her steps slow, as if the weight of the world was pushing down on her shoulders. She had no home, no family, and no place where she belonged. The cold wind cut through her clothing, making her shiver as she hugged herself for warmth. Her thoughts raced. What was she supposed to do now? Where could she go? As she walked, she saw the bustling city, full of life and energy, but to her, it felt like a prison. Alien merchants sold exotic goods from their stalls, and groups of various species laughed and talked, but none paid her any attention. She didn't exist in their eyes. Her heart ached with loneliness, and she wondered if she would ever find a place where she could feel safe. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. Zira's heart raced as a group of 3 rough-looking aliens emerged from the shadows. Their eyes glinted with malice as they sized her up. The leader, a tall, burly alien with scales on his arms, smirked. Well, what do we have here? A lost little stray, he sneered, his voice rough and deep. Zira took a step back, sensing danger. She had been through worse in her life, but there was something about these aliens that made her stomach twist with fear. She backed away slowly, but the thugs moved in, blocking her path. We could make this night more interesting, the leader said, his grin widening as he cracked his knuckles. Zira's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but the street was empty and the alley was narrow. The city's security drones hovered overhead, but they were indifferent to the scene unfolding below. Zira knew that if she screamed for help, no one would come. She was invisible to this world, and her fate was in the hands of these strangers. Just as the leader lunged forward to grab her, a flash of motion appeared out of nowhere. A figure dressed in a sleek, high-tech combat suit materialized from the shadows, moving with the speed and precision of someone trained for battle. The figure took down the thugs effortlessly, one punch to the leader, a swift kick to the second, and a perfectly timed elbow to the third. Within seconds, the street was silent again. Zira stared in shock as the figure approached her. The human soldier, a man in his late 20s, lowered his hood, revealing a strong, determined face. His brown eyes met hers, and for a moment, Zira felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Who was this human, and why had he saved her? "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. His accent was unmistakably human, a deep, soothing tone that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the city. "Get up. We need to move before others show up." Zira, still shaken, hesitated for a moment, but then reached out to accept his hand. She didn't know what else to do. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in a world that didn't care about her. But this man, this human, had offered her something she had almost given up on: help. As she stood up, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of person he was. A soldier by the looks of his suit, but there was something more to him. There was a kindness in his eyes, an understanding that Zira couldn't quite explain. She hadn't expected compassion from anyone, especially not a human. But here he was, helping her when the rest of the galaxy had turned its back on he. He led her through the winding streets, his eyes constantly scanning for danger, but also offering her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. The city felt less cold now, though it was still the same alien place that had rejected her. "This way," he said, guiding her toward a hidden entrance. "I'll take you somewhere safe." As they walked, Zira's mind raced. Who was this human? Why had he helped her? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do now that she had someone on her side? For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for her. But as they neared the entrance, a shadow passed overhead, a cloaked alien ship, its shape barely visible against the dark sky. Zira's heart skipped a beat. The very ones who had cast her aside were watching her now. She wasn't safe yet. The human soldier glanced up, his expression hardening. "They'll come for you," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "But don't worry. I won't let them take you." Zira felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that the night was far from over. The danger had only just begun. The hidden entrance they approached was a small, unmarked door tucked behind a row of old, crumbling buildings. It looked like nothing special, just another rundown part of the city that most people ignored. But to Zira, it felt like a lifeline. She followed the human soldier, whose name she had yet to learn, through the narrow doorway. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft thud, and suddenly, the noise of the outside world, the bustling streets, the drones, the distant alien chatter, faded into an eerie silence. Inside, the air was warmer, the lighting dim and soft, casting long shadows along the walls. The room smelled faintly of earth and metal, a strange but welcoming combination. There were no windows, but Zira could sense the hidden technology all around her. Cloaking devices, hidden communication arrays, and tools she couldn't fully understand, all tucked away like secrets. She stood for a moment, taking in her surroundings, still unsure of what would happen next. The soldier motioned for her to sit down on one of the worn-out chairs near a table cluttered with various maps and weapons. Zira obeyed, her thoughts racing. What did he want from her? She had been abandoned, rejected by her own kind. And now here she was, sitting in a safe room with a human who had rescued her. "So," the soldier said as he took off his helmet and set it aside, revealing his rugged face. His hair was short, brown, and slightly tousled, as if he had been running for hours. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since she had arrived on this strange planet, Zira felt a sense of calm wash over her. "You're safe now, but we don't have much time. The alien bounty hunters will be after you soon. They'll stop at nothing to get you." Zira swallowed, unsure of what to say. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice soft and uncertain. "You don't even know me." He gave her a half-smile. "I know enough," he said. "My name's Jack. I've seen what happens to people like you, the ones who get abandoned by their own kind. It's not right, and I can't just walk away from it." Zira's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard someone speak like that before, so caring, so willing to help a stranger. She had expected nothing from anyone, especially a human. The galaxy was so vast and cold, filled with different species and their own agendas. There was no room for someone like her. But Jack was different. There was no greed in his eyes, no ulterior motive, just a simple, pure desire to help. "But I'm not one of your kind," Zira whispered, looking down at her hands. "I'm not like you." Jack leaned against the table, folding his arms. doesn't matter to me. You're someone who needs help, and I'm not going to turn my back on you. We might not be the same species, but that doesn't mean we can't work together." Zira looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his brown ones. For the first time, she felt seen. Not as an alien, not as someone different, but as a person, someone worth fighting for. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that she hadn't felt in ages. Jack stood up and walked to a wall where a large screen flickered to life. The display showed a map of the city and surrounding areas, with red dots marking locations of interest. "This is where the aliens are keeping track of you," he said, tapping the screen. "They know you're here, and they'll be coming for you. It's only a matter of time before they try to take you back, or worse." Zira's heart sank as she looked at the map. These weren't just random locations. They were places where the bounty hunters were circling, ready to strike. Jack was right. She wasn't safe here for long. But she didn't feel fear like before. There was something about Jack's presence that made her believe they had a chance to escape. "I'll help you," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "I can't just sit here and wait to be captured. I've been running for so long. If we're going to make it out of this, we need to fight back." Jack turned to face her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "You'd really help me?" Zira nodded. "I may not know much about your world, but I know how to survive. And if that means fighting, then I'll fight." A look of respect crossed Jack's face. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not she was serious. Finally, he gave her a nod. "All right then. I'm in. But you need to be careful. The aliens we're dealing with aren't like the others you've seen. They're dangerous." Zira stood up, determination hardening in her chest. "I'm ready." They worked together in silence for a while, Jack showing her how to use the cloaking devices and the weapons that lay scattered across the room. Zira wasn't used to such advanced technology, but Jack was patient with her. He explained everything step by step, making sure she understood the gravity of their situation. As they trained, Zira felt a sense of purpose fill her, something she hadn't felt since before her people had cast her aside. Despite the heavy atmosphere, there were moments of shared laughter between them. Jack made jokes about his past missions, and Zira would laugh quietly, her confidence growing with each passing minute. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming part of something. When the training session ended, they sat down for a moment, catching their breath. Zira looked around the room again, her thoughts wandering. She had gone from being abandoned and alone to standing here, preparing to fight alongside a human soldier who saw her as an ally, not a burden. It was a strange, surreal feeling, but it was the most hope she had felt in a long time. Jack stood and checked the time on his wristpad. "It's almost time. We need to move fast." Zira stood up as well, feeling the weight of the upcoming battle settle on her shoulders. She wasn't sure if they would win, but for the first time, she had someone who would fight by her side. And that, in itself, was worth everything. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. Together, they left the safe room, ready to face whatever the galaxy threw their way. The world outside the safe room was a far cry from the warmth and security Zira had felt inside. The moment they stepped into the streets, the harsh reality of the city hit her like a slap. The tall buildings, now more imposing than ever, seemed to tower over them, casting long shadows that swallowed the light. It was a dangerous world, one that Zira had come to know too well. But now, with Jack by her side, it felt like they had a fighting chance. The streets were chaotic, filled with a constant hum of alien life forms. Merchants shouted over the noise, trying to sell their wares, while groups of various species walked by, their eyes glinting with curiosity and disdain. Zira had always felt like an outsider here, but now she was moving with purpose, her steps quick and steady as Jack led the way. Jack's presence beside her was like a shield. She couldn't help but notice how he moved, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd, his posture tense, alert to any signs of danger. He didn't trust anyone here, and neither did she. This world was full of threats, and no one was safe, especially not someone like Zira. But Jack had given her hope, and that hope made her stronger. As they navigated the streets, Zira couldn't help but notice the way people looked at her. Some stared openly, their gazes full of judgment and curiosity. Others avoided her entirely, pretending she wasn't even there. It was a reminder of how alone she truly was, how easily she could disappear into the shadows, forgotten by all. But Jack was there, and for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. They made their way toward a more secluded part of the city, where the buildings grew smaller and the streets narrower. It was an area that Jack knew well, a place where they could blend in and regroup. As they turned a corner, Zira caught sight of a group of alien soldiers standing near a building, their eyes scanning the crowd. She tensed, instinctively moving closer to Jack. They were looking for her, she realized. The bounty hunters had already started their search, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Jack seemed to sense her unease. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "We need to keep moving." Zira nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the danger was already closing in on them. She didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. The city was vast, and there were too many places where they could be spotted. They moved swiftly, sticking to the back alleys and shadows, avoiding the main streets where the bounty hunters were most likely to search. Zira's mind raced as she thought about what would happen if they were caught. What would they do to her? What would Jack do? She couldn't let that happen. Not now, not when they were so close to escaping this nightmare. The tension between them grew with every step. Zira's breathing was shallow, and Jack's pace quickened as they turned another corner. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Zira's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head, scanning the area for any signs of movement, but saw nothing. Still, the fear gnawed at her, a constant presence in her chest. She had been abandoned before, but this time, she wasn't alone. Jack was here, and he was determined to keep her safe. They reached a small, hidden door at the end of the alleyway. Jack checked the surroundings carefully before opening it, motioning for Zira to go first. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We'll stay here for a while, regroup, and figure out our next move." Zira stepped inside, and the door closed silently behind them. The room they entered was small, dimly lit, and filled with the scent of old metal and machinery. It looked like a storage space, filled with crates and supplies. There were no windows, no way to see outside, but it was safe, at least for the moment. Zira breathed a sigh of relief, leaning against the wall as she tried to steady her racing heart. Jack immediately began to scan the room, checking the supplies, setting up some basic security measures. Zira watched him, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had gone from being rejected and alone on the streets to being caught in a dangerous world of bounty hunters, alien factions, and a fight for survival. It felt like a dream, one she wasn't sure she was prepared to wake up from. But there was something about Jack's presence that made it all seem possible. After a few minutes, Jack turned to her, his expression serious. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low. "The bounty hunters won't stop looking for you, but I have a plan. It's risky, but it's our best shot at getting you off this planet." Zira listened intently, her mind focused on the plan that Jack was laying out. It involved leaving the city, traveling through the outskirts, and making contact with a group of rebels who could help them escape. It sounded like a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. Jack had a way of making even the most dangerous plans seem possible. "What do you need me to do?" Zira asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. She had already decided that she wouldn't sit idly by. If they were going to escape, she would fight for it. Jack smiled slightly, as if he had expected her to say that. "I need you to stay focused, to follow my lead. This won't be easy, but we're in this together." Zira nodded, feeling the surge of determination rise within her. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim of the world around her. She was a part of something bigger, and she wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. As Jack continued to explain the plan, Zira couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she had landed in. It was a dangerous place, filled with dangers she had never imagined. But with Jack by her side, she realized that maybe she had a chance to survive it. Together, they could fight back. Together, they could make it out alive. The road ahead would be hard, but it was a road she was willing to walk. The plan had seemed so simple at first. Jack had explained it to Zira with his usual calm demeanor, outlining each step with precision. They were going to leave the hidden storage space, move quietly through the city outskirts, and reach the rebel group that Jack had contact with. From there, they would escape to safety. It was their only chance. But things didn't go as planned. The night was falling, and the city's lights cast an eerie glow on the deserted streets. Zira followed Jack closely, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust covering the ground. They moved quickly, blending into the shadows, doing their best to avoid being spotted. Jack's plan was risky, but it was the best option they had. Zira trusted him, even though the fear gnawed at her. Every step they took seemed to echo in the empty streets, as if the world was holding its breath. Zira nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the danger was already closing in on them. She didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden. The city was vast, and there were too many places where they could be spotted. They moved swiftly, sticking to the back alleys and shadows, avoiding the main streets where the bounty hunters were most likely to search. Zira's mind raced as she thought about what would happen if they were caught. What would they do to her? What would Jack do? She couldn't let that happen. Not now, not when they were so close to escaping this nightmare. The tension between them grew with every step. Zira's breathing was shallow, and Jack's pace quickened as they turned another corner. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Zira's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head, scanning the area for any signs of movement, but saw nothing. Still, the fear gnawed at her, a constant presence in her chest. She had been abandoned before, but this time, she wasn't alone. Jack was here, and he was determined to keep her safe. They reached a small, hidden door at the end of the alleyway. Jack checked the surroundings carefully before opening it, motioning for Zira to go first. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We'll stay here for a while, regroup, and figure out our next move." Zira stepped inside, and the door closed silently behind them. The room they entered was small, dimly lit, and filled with the scent of old metal and machinery. It looked like a storage space, filled with crates and supplies. There were no windows, no way to see outside, but it was safe, at least for the moment. Zira breathed a sigh of relief, leaning against the wall as she tried to steady her racing heart. Jack immediately began to scan the room, checking the supplies, setting up some basic security measures. Zira watched him, still trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had gone from being rejected and alone on the streets to being caught in a dangerous world of bounty hunters, alien factions, and a fight for survival. It felt like a dream, one she wasn't sure she was prepared to wake up from. But there was something about Jack's presence that made it all seem possible. After a few minutes, Jack turned to her, his expression serious. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low. "The bounty hunters won't stop looking for you, but I have a plan. It's risky, but it's our best shot at getting you off this planet." Zira listened intently, her mind focused on the plan that Jack was laying out. It involved leaving the city, traveling through the outskirts, and making contact with a group of rebels who could help them escape. It sounded like a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. Jack had a way of making even the most dangerous plans seem possible. "What do you need me to do?" Zira asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. She had already decided that she wouldn't sit idly by. If they were going to escape, she would fight for it. Jack smiled slightly, as if he had expected her to say that. "I need you to stay focused, to follow my lead. This won't be easy, but we're in this together." Zira nodded, feeling the surge of determination rise within her. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim of the world around her. She was a part of something bigger, and she wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. As Jack continued to explain the plan, Zira couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she had landed in. It was a dangerous place, filled with dangers she had never imagined. But with Jack by her side, she realized that maybe she had a chance to survive it. Together, they could fight back. Together, they could make it out alive. The road ahead would be hard, but it was a road she was willing to walk. The plan had seemed so simple at first. Jack had explained it to Zira with his usual calm demeanor, outlining each step with precision. They were going to leave the hidden storage space, move quietly through the city outskirts, and reach the rebel group that Jack had contact with. From there, they would escape to safety. It was their only chance. But things didn't go as planned. The night was falling, and the city's lights cast an eerie glow on the deserted streets. Zira followed Jack closely, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust covering the ground. They moved quickly, blending into the shadows, doing their best to avoid being spotted. Jack's plan was risky, but it was the best option they had. Zira trusted him, even though the fear gnawed at her. Every step they took seemed to echo in the empty streets, as if the world was holding its breath. As they rounded a corner, Zira saw an alleyway that led to an underground tunnel. It was their last hope. She tugged at Jack's sleeve, pointing to the tunnel. Without hesitation, Jack led the way, but as they entered the dark, narrow passage, the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. They were almost there, but Zira could sense the danger closing in. Then, without warning, Jack pushed her forward, his hand on her back urging her to keep moving. "Go," he shouted. "Get out of here. I'll hold them off." Zira's heart dropped into her stomach. "No, Jack, you can't." But he didn't wait for her to finish. With one last glance, he turned back toward the entrance of the tunnel, facing the oncoming soldiers. Zira didn't have time to argue. She could hear the sounds of a fight breaking out behind her as she ran deeper into the tunnel, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. She didn't know if Jack would make it out alive, but one thing was certain: he had sacrificed himself so she could escape. The thought of it nearly broke her heart, but it also gave her the strength to keep moving. Jack had given everything for her, and she would make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the darkness of the tunnel swallowed her whole, Zira realized that she had been given a second chance. It was up to her to survive, to fight for the life Jack had given her. And no matter what, she would keep moving forward. Zira's heart raced as she ran through the dark, twisting tunnels beneath the city. The sound of Jack's sacrifice still echoed in her mind. She had barely escaped, her legs aching, and her breath coming in sharp gasps. But there was no time to mourn. She had to survive. Jack had given his life so that she could have a chance, and she couldn't let that be for nothing. The weight of his sacrifice pushed her forward, each step driven by the need to honor his memory. The tunnel stretched on, its walls damp and cold. She couldn't see much in the dark, only the faint glow of her flashlight illuminating the way ahead. Zira's mind raced as she tried to piece together her options. The rebels who had betrayed them had to be stopped. She knew that she couldn't run forever. She had to face them, confront the ones who had lied to her, the ones who had used Jack's life as a pawn in their game. As she moved deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, she began to hear faint sounds ahead. Voices, low and muffled, carried through the cold, concrete walls. Zira pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as she listened. The voices grew louder, and she recognized the harsh tone of the alien leader who had set them up. He was speaking with someone, probably his men, giving orders, planning the next phase of the operation. Zira's pulse quickened. She knew this was it. The moment of truth. She had found them. Taking a deep breath, she moved forward, her footsteps cautious but steady. She had to be careful. They were stronger, more heavily armed, but she had something they didn't: the element of surprise. She had to use it. Peeking around the corner, she saw the leader standing with several of his soldiers, their weapons slung over their shoulders as they discussed their next move. They were so focused on their plans that they didn't notice her approach. Zira's hand moved to her belt, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the gun Jack had given her. It felt heavy, the weight of it reminding her of how much was at stake. She had to be smart. She had to strike at the right moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she adjusted her position, taking careful aim. The leader's back was turned, giving her the perfect opportunity. But just as she was about to make her move, a noise came from behind her. A small scuffle, just enough to draw attention. She cursed under her breath, realizing she'd made a mistake. The soldiers whipped around, their eyes scanning the darkness. Zira's pulse raced as she ducked into the shadows, holding her breath, hoping they hadn't seen her. She could hear their footsteps getting closer, each one a reminder of how dangerous this situation was. Her mind raced, thinking of a plan, but time was running out. Suddenly, she heard a voice from the leader. "Find her. She's here somewhere." The hunt had begun. Zira's heart skipped a beat. She had to act fast. With no time to waste, Zira decided to take the offensive. She pulled the gun from her belt, her fingers tight around the grip. The soldiers were getting closer, their voices growing louder. Zira's fingers brushed the trigger, but then something strange happened. The walls seemed to close in on her. The air became thick, as if the weight of her emotions had created a barrier. She felt the presence of someone watching her. In the split second it took for her to realize what was happening, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, her gun raised, but it wasn't a soldier standing there. It was Jack, but it wasn't the Jack she remembered. His eyes were different, cold and empty, and his once calm demeanor was replaced by a fierce, ruthless determination. "Jack?" Zira whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to you?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his body moving with unnatural speed. The light from Zira's flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow on his face. He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at her. Zira's breath caught in her throat. "Jack, no," she cried out, stepping back. "You're not like this. You're not one of them." But Jack's expression remained unchanged. He didn't speak, just moved closer, the weapon in his hand steady. Zira's heart ached as she realized the horrible truth. The soldiers hadn't just betrayed her, they had turned Jack into one of them. He was no longer the man she had known. He was now part of the enemy, his will controlled by the very forces she had been fighting against. Tears stung Zira's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't give up. She had to fight for Jack, for the man who had saved her, who had sacrificed everything for her. She couldn't let him be lost forever. With a surge of strength, Zira pushed the grief aside and raised her gun. But before she could make a move, Jack lunged at her. Their guns collided, the sound of metal crashing echoing through the tunnel. Zira fought back with everything she had, but Jack was too strong, his movements almost mechanical. "Jack, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I know you're still in there. Fight it. You have to fight it." But Jack didn't respond. He knocked the gun from her hand, sending it clattering to the floor. Zira scrambled for it, but before she could reach it, Jack was on her, pinning her to the ground. She could feel his strength, his cold hands gripping her arms, but there was something else. Beneath the coldness, she felt a flicker of warmth, a faint recognition in his eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw a flash of the man she had known, the man who had saved her life, the man who had been her ally. It was so brief, she almost doubted it. And then, in that moment, Zira knew what she had to do. With every ounce of strength, she reached up, grabbing Jack by the face, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Jack," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. I'm not giving up on you. You can still choose. Fight back. Please. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, Zira's heart racing. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Jack's body tensed. He jerked back, shaking his head as if trying to fight something inside him. The coldness in his eyes began to fade, replaced by confusion, pain, and finally, recognition. Jack staggered back, his breath heavy. "Zira," he whispered, his voice cracked. I'm so sorry." Before Zira could say anything, the leader's voice rang out behind her. "Finish them both off." The final battle had just begun. The chaos of the final battle raged around Zira and Jack as the enemy soldiers advanced. Jack stood beside her, his face a mix of confusion and determination. It was hard to believe that just moments ago, he had been one of them, the enemy, cold and ruthless. But now he was back. The man who had saved her, who had risked everything for her, was standing with her once again. She couldn't let that go to waste. She couldn't let his return be in vain. Zira and Jack took cover behind a large metal pillar, their breaths heavy and ragged. The enemy soldiers were closing in, and their weapons gleamed in the dim light of the underground chamber. Zira could hear the hum of their energy shields, the low whir of their rifles powering up. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. "Jack," Zira said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have to end this. Now." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. His eyes were no longer empty. The strange, mechanical control that had taken over him was gone. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he stood, strong, defiant, and determined. He was back. And together, they were going to fight for their future. Without another word, they both sprang into action. Zira pulled a small device from her belt and pressed a button, activating a series of cloaking fields around them. The world around them seemed to melt away as their bodies vanished from view. The soldiers continued to advance, unaware that the two rebels were right under their noses. Zira and Jack moved swiftly and silently, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cold metal floor. They navigated the dark corridors of the underground facility, knowing that the moment they were spotted, the battle would be over. There was no room for mistakes. They had to get to the control room, where the leader and his inner circle were, before it was too late. As they neared the entrance to the control room, Zira signaled for Jack to stop. She could hear voices inside, low and ominous. The leader was giving orders, preparing for the final phase of their plan. Zira knew that if they didn't act fast, they would lose their chance to stop the enemy once and for all. She motioned for Jack to stay close and approached the door. With a quick swipe of her hand, she activated a small explosive device, planting it silently on the door's locking mechanism. The countdown began. Zira glanced at Jack, her eyes locking with his. They didn't need to say anything. They knew what was at stake. The explosion was silent but powerful. The door burst open with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. Zira and Jack stormed in, weapons drawn, ready for whatever came next. The enemy leader was standing at a control panel, surrounded by his guards. He looked up, his face twisted in anger and surprise as he saw them. "You," he spat. "I thought you were finished." "Not yet," Jack replied coldly, his voice full of determination. "We're just getting started." Without hesitation, Zira and Jack opened fire, their weapons roaring to life. The enemy guards scrambled to defend themselves, but they were no match for the two rebels. Zira's shots were precise, each one taking down a soldier with deadly accuracy. Jack moved like a whirlwind, his combat skills honed from years of training. The soldiers fell one by one, their cries of pain drowned out by the sound of gunfire. The leader tried to flee, but Zira wasn't about to let him escape. She lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm and slamming him against the control panel. His eyes widened in fear as she held him there, her grip unyielding. "You've lost," she said, her voice steady and strong. "It's over." The leader struggled, but Zira tightened her hold. You thought you could control everything. You thought you could manipulate us, use us as pawns in your game. But you're wrong. With a final, forceful movement, she slammed him to the ground, knocking the weapon from his hand. The control room was silent now, the sound of the battle fading into the distance. Zira stood over the fallen leader, her chest heaving with adrenaline. Jack approached, his face grim. He took a deep breath, his eyes still filled with a mixture of anger and relief. "It's done," he said quietly. Zira nodded, her heart still racing. The danger wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. They had stopped the enemy's plan, but there was more to do. There were still many more battles ahead. The war wasn't over. The fight for freedom was just beginning. As Zira and Jack made their way out of the control room, they encountered several more soldiers, but they were no match for the two of them now. Together, they fought their way through the complex, determined to make sure that no one else would suffer because of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. The escape was tense, every corner potentially hiding another enemy. But Zira and Jack moved as a single unit, trusting each other completely. Their bond had been forged through hardship, through loss, and now it would see them through to the end. When they finally emerged into the night, the air cool and crisp against their skin, Zira felt a sense of relief wash over her. The war wasn't over, but they had survived. And with Jack by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. "Where do we go from here?" Jack asked, his voice soft but hopeful. Zira smiled, a small but genuine smile. "We rebuild. We fight for those who can't fight for themselves, and we make sure that no one else has to go through what we did." For the first time in a long time, Zira felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But with Jack at her side, and with the strength they had gained from their trials, Zira knew they could face anything. Together, they had found something worth fighting for, and in the face of darkness, they had discovered the light of a new beginning.